Thank you, John, so much for coming to give this talk on this Earth Day. It's an absolutely fitting celebration of Earth Day that we celebrate plants. And I'm Sandy Knapp, and I'm the current president of the Linnean Society of London. And those of you who are here are not fellows of the Society, please do think about becoming a fellow. The Society is one of those institutions which brings together people across all walks of life and from all backgrounds who have an interest in nature and natural history. And so do think about becoming a fellow, and we welcome people to become fellows of the Society, no matter where they're from, what their background is, but just all of us love nature. And that's one of the really wonderful things about the Society, is it's a place where we can talk about not only the beauties and wonders of nature that surrounds us, but also some of the things about how we can actually preserve it and restore it on the planet today. So tonight I have the incredible privilege of introducing Jonathan Drori, who's currently a trustee of the Eden Project and of the Cambridge University Botanical Garden, and an honorary professor at the Birmingham Institute of Forestry Research. He spent 9 years on the board of RBGQ and also has been on the board of the Woodland Trust. He's an ambassador for the World Wildlife Foundation, and in a previous life, perhaps not the life that he's leading now, he was a documentary filmmaker with the BBC, but we're so glad that he's now devoted his life to telling people about the wonderful things about plants with which we share the planet. So tonight, he's going to talk to us about his latest book, Around the World in 80 Plants. And many of you will have perhaps read the earlier book, Around the World in 80 Trees. And he'll tell us, I mean, I'm so excited to hear the number of stories he'll tell us about the plants which have evolved to intricately entwined with our own history and our own culture. So please, John, thank you so much for coming to share your insights with us tonight. And I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sandy. If you ever want a completely different career, you could be an agent. So, thank you for that very fulsome introduction. Hello, everyone. Let me tell you that this is going to be a lot easier and a lot better if you've got a drink in your hand. It'll be less stressful for me and a lot less stressful for you. So you know, find something to drink. This is a nature reading, which means that it's not a sort of an academic lecture, and that means that I've put references and acknowledgements and photo credits and things like that, not within the body of what I'm going to talk about, but on my website, and I'll put up that address at the end. So you know, if you think I'm not acknowledging people, I am really. This is my father and me. I'm the little guy on the right. I'm about 7 years old there, and this is Saturday afternoon. You can tell he's a first-generation immigrant because he's wearing a suit to go to Kew Gardens on a Saturday afternoon. And this was my first memory, really, of being really fascinated by plants. And the way that I became fascinated was through my mother and father telling my brother and me stories about plants rather than facts. And the stories they told were sometimes poignant, sometimes, you know, they told me the story of slavery through Dieffenbachia, which was used as a punishment plant in the Deep South. And sometimes they gave us tastes of things. And here's a plant which you might recognize that I remember having a lick of, that latex, which it's an opium poppy. And I remember the sensation of the latex and the opium on my tongue. It just sort of made my tongue ever so slightly numb. It had a much bigger effect on my school teacher when I told her, who first of all didn't believe that my father was feeding me opium, and then called a social worker to come around and talk to my mum. And I remember my mother sort of said in that wonderful rhetorical way, but it's only opium, does that matter? but this was a way that I remember plants very well because of the way they taste and so on, and the smells that they have. And I think that's a way of encouraging children. Later on, I had the opportunity to travel, and these, pandanus, the quiver tree of Namibia, the amazing wax palms in Colombia, and so on. The more I saw of plants, the more I thought, there's just an extraordinary diversity. You wouldn't, if you were from another planet, you wouldn't look at these and think these are all the same, the same kingdom. Absolutely incredible diversity from these hugely enormous trees that the coastal redwoods, that's my wife at the bottom there, that tiny figure, to these tiny mosses, the blue seeds of Ravenala, the traveler's palm from Madagascar. The extraordinary thing is that so many of these, about 40% of all the world's plants, are endangered now, and I can't help feeling that the more we appreciate them, the more we'll want to protect them. So this plant here, I just want to sort of highlight for a second, because it's woody nightshade, and it's a member of a plant family called the solanums. And quite a few of the plants this evening are solanums, in honor of Sandy Knapp, our president, who is an expert on solanums. And that's always a bit worrying to have the sort of teacher breathing down your neck, but you'll find there are a few solanums tonight. Incredible diversity, though. That's the thing that I want to get across. And when I was up in the Andes on a Q expedition once, I saw this bird, not this actual bird, but a similar one. It's the world's largest hummingbird. And I was looking at it and thinking, that is just the most extraordinary animal and amazing thing. It's easily the size of my hand. And I was watching it, and I called over this botanist who I was with, and I said, look, there's this amazing bird. And he said, God, it'd be fantastic when it gets out of the way and we can see the plant behind it properly. And that moment, I mean, it's a sort of funny moment, but I realize is a sort of reverse of how people normally see plants, because people are sort of have this plant blindness. They, they'll only look at the thing that moves, and human beings are programmed to do that. We sense patterns and we sense things that are moving very quickly, and we tend to ignore the things that aren't. But plants are massively important to us. Now, plants have to do everything they do while they're rooted to the spot. So they have to feed themselves, defend themselves, reproduce without being able to move very much or very fast. And that leads to some fantastic bits of evolution. So one of the things that I discovered when I was doing some work at Bristol University over about 15 years, I asked people every year, a group of about 60 science graduates, I asked them a question, which was, a little seed weighs next to nothing, and a big tree weighs a lot, and a bag of charcoal obviously comes from the tree. Where did all the stuff come from? Right? Where did all the mass come from? And every year for 15 years, 80% approximately of those 60 people said out of the ground. And another 10% said from sunlight. So it's quite interesting that you think that sunlight can turn into mass. That's a good one. But I said, when you have a pot plant, how often do you top up the soil? And they go, oh, well, I've never really topped up the soil. And I said, yeah, you have this big pot plant. Where did all the stuff come from? And of course, and I know that the stuff comes out of the air, carbon dioxide out of the air through the leaves. And the other ingredient is water that comes up through the roots. So the only thing you sort of mostly add to a pot plant is water. and the thing grows like topsy, and you occasionally might put in a little bit of something else, a few other nutrients. But the main mass comes from just these two ingredients: carbon dioxide, which is surprisingly heavy stuff, through the leaves, and water through the roots. And this is the miracle of photosynthesis, and it's powered by sunlight, of course. And if you need any more convincing, then here's Spanish moss. This is Tillandsia. It's not actually a moss and not actually Spanish, but it's a cousin of the pineapple. And it grows, it's an epiphyte, and it grows hanging on trees in the American Deep South. It's very much the look and feel of Gone with the Wind, which is appropriate, really, because it gets what it needs from the air, from rain. It doesn't have roots that go into the tree or anything. The extra nutrients it needs might come from dust in the air or maybe the odd bird dropping. And it's very odd, kind of curly stuff. And it used to be used for stuffing mattresses and also the seats of early motor cars. And it looks like these, someone got a bit over enthusiastic with stuffing the seats on that motor car. But as you can see, it grows even on electricity cables and in midair, no soil needed. So that's Tillandsia, sort of proving the point about photosynthesis. And the book, which I've been asked to refer to, by the way, because it's a reading, so I'll do little readings here and there. The book has these wonderful illustrations by Lucille Clerc, who's a French artist living in London. I'm just going to read you a little piece about Spanish moss. An eerily iconic plant of the swampy southern states, it has skeletal, finger-length leaves that curl together into chains, forming elongated grey-green curtains that drape from trees and telephone wires. Victorian travellers to the deep south wrote melodramatically of trees that swept the cobwebs from the sky or appeared to them as witches weeping in the moonlight. It is indeed a strange plant. Spanish moss is used to stuff hoodoo dolls, charms believed to ward off evil and bring good fortune to oneself, or more rarely, misfortune to another. Hoodoo is a spiritual offshoot of Louisiana voodoo, a system of beliefs that developed in the southern states from the traditions of the West African diaspora transported there in the 18th century. The link with hoodoo talismans contributes to the plant's creepy reputation. But the people who craft those dolls may be playing on more primitive emotions. Perhaps Spanish moss and the swamps it inhabits embody nature untamed, rampant, and beyond our control. So, water carries chemicals around the plant and keeps tissues turgid, but along with carbon dioxide, it's one of the two vital ingredients in photosynthesis. Plants will do anything to get water. Most striking, obviously, is when water is short. So in deserts, these dragon trees, or this dragon tree of Socotra, which is off the coast of Yemen, manages to funnel every little bit of rainfall or dew down and down and down through all those little kind of junctions between the stems, between the branches and down into the middle. Cacti protect their precious water with spines. They also have a special kind of metabolism that allows them to take in carbon dioxide in the cool of the night, chemically store it until the next day when the sunlight allows them to do their photosynthesis thing. And that way they don't have to open their tiny pores, their stomata, in their leaves during the day and risk losing all that water vapor through evaporation. Really clever. And if you look at this aloe vera plant, that's the aloe vera that you've heard about through cosmetics and so on. The tough armored leaves with a nasty, bitter, horrible bitter layer that if you bite into it, it's really disgusting. And the water inside protected, well, stored as a gel. Absolutely, so many plants have this vital relationship with water. And the lengths that plants will go to get their water, I think is sort of exemplified for me by this. This is mujar, is the Aboriginal name. This is from Western Australia. In fact, it's called the Western Australian Christmas tree. Look how it's bursting with life. Look at this when it's all rather dry around, if you notice. And mujar has a dirty secret. It's a parasite, or it's a hemiparasite, because it still photosynthesizes. It's got its leaves, you can see them. But it sends out its roots over incredibly long distances, 80 meters or more. And it attaches a collar. See if I can get a picture there, a collar around its prey. And this collar has within it a pair of hydraulic secateurs. And it severs the host root and then attaches itself, it sort of, and plugs itself in essentially, and gets the water from the other plant, and probably a few other bits of nutrients and things as well. Now, it's the way that it sniffs out those other roots and things in order to plug itself in such a scary way is also sort of rather clever, because if you think about it, roots are underground. They can't see, and even if they could see, there isn't any light. But they use sort of chemical signals, and one of the chemical signals that they follow is a sort of plant hormone that is also present in some plastics. Now, this has the result that these plants will seek out and sever telephone wires that are buried. And one of the things that I sort of love about this is that it's kind of plants fighting back. It's, sort of getting their own back. But an extraordinary thing that there's the Western Australian Christmas tree that will go to such lengths to find water that it'll sever telephone wires in its search. So if water is one half of the photosynthesis equation, the other half is carbon dioxide. And this is what leaves are primarily for, is getting hold of carbon dioxide from the air, and then doing the photosynthetic magic. They're chemical factories, really. And all these amazing leaves, they're all filling some kind of niche. They've all evolved in clever ways. One of the things I love about leaves is that they have a remarkable built-in redundancy. So I've actually chosen leaves here which are sort of beautiful and perfect and everything. But even this one, which has some sort of disease, I think, still works as a leaf. And if a caterpillar has eaten half a leaf, then the other half still works. This leaf here, you can see, has a drip tip to keep the leaf drier and free from fungi as a result. So if we look at one of my favorite leaves here, this is the giant water lily. Victoria amazonica, named after Queen Victoria, grows in the Amazon area. I love the way that it's evolved with spouts. Can you see those? So that it doesn't get completely full of water. Isn't that wonderful? And the system of load-bearing struts was the inspiration for the Crystal Palace. So in the 19th century, in 1851, when the Great Exhibition opened at Crystal Palace, 3 times the size of St. Paul's, this was the architect's inspiration. And absolutely fantastic thing. And what you can't see in the picture here is that these, in order to protect themselves from fish that might otherwise attack it, or other animals, it's got these kind of really quite unpleasant spines. So quite why that chap has his arms bare like that, I'm not sure. I've tried it and it hurts like frenzy. Now this enables the plant efficiently to use the water surface, and gather lots of light and lots of carbon dioxide. But it also, of course, serves another purpose, which is to support one of the great photo cliches of our time, the baby on top of the Victoria Amazonica waterlily leaf. We've all done it, haven't we? Admit it. Now, here's another one that I absolutely love, and I'm sure you recognize this from anyone who's been brought up in South or Southeast Asia will go completely kind of misty-eyed now, because this is the lotus. And just about all parts of the plant are edible and actually rather delicious. It grows in water. The seed head it looks sort of alarmingly and disturbingly like a shower head. And there's an amazing kind of underwater breathing system for the roots. You know, roots need oxygen, and there's a fantastic kind of temperature. There's you know, it's like a kind of air pump that works on temperature differentials. That's very, very clever and gets oxygen down to the roots. But what I especially like about the lotus, because I'm an ex-engineer, is the way that it cleans its leaves. And the way that it does it is, you've probably noticed that water tends to form globules on certain surfaces. So you've seen Gore-Tex. Well, the inspiration for Gore-Tex came from this plant, from the lotus. And rather unsurprisingly, it's called the Lotus effect. Under a scanning electron microscope, there are very, very tiny sort of nanometer scale protrusions on the leaf that mean that the water can't sort of spread out and form you know, it can't wet the surface, but instead keeps this kind of globule, which then rolls around the leaf as it sways, and it sweeps up any dirt and detritus and little fungal spores and things like that. So the thing remains in, you know, fantastically clean. And that cleanliness has sort of meant that it's, you know, it often grows in quite sort of murky water. And that cleanliness has associated the plant with various religions. From an engineering point of view, this lotus effect is the inspiration not just for Gore-Tex, but all sorts of sort of self-cleaning windows and things like that. But in Hinduism, the goddess Lakshmi is usually depicted couched on a lotus flower, also holding a lotus blossom, if you can see. And you know, the lotus denotes purity and also wealth and fertility. And in Buddhism, well, let me just read you a paragraph. The sacred lotus has deep religious meaning in Asian cultures and is a common motif in art, architecture, and sculpture, where deities are often placed on lotus thrones. In Buddhism, by tradition, lotus plants sprouted in the first footsteps of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and a common mantra among Tibetan Buddhists, Om Mani Padme Hum, draws together the lotus with enlightenment and inestimable worth in one hypnotically repeated Sanskrit phrase. The lotus, perfect and unsullied by the muddy waters in which it grows, with glittering beads of water that dance and sparkle jewel-like in the center of its leaves, symbolizes the spiritual journey towards light and wisdom. So this is another one of Lucille's fantastic illustrations for the book. You know, she is so talented. And now we're at sea, and I have another short reading for you, this time about phytoplankton. Microscopic single-celled organisms may not fit everyone's definition of a plant, but a plant's most important capability is to photosynthesize, and phytoplankton certainly do that. Most of them live for just a few days, drifting on ocean currents, suspended near the surface where there's light. Using sunshine to power the process, phytoplankton consume carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater and incorporate carbon compounds into their tiny bodies, just as carbon is stored by the wood and leaves of a tree. They may be small, but they're abundant. A tablespoon of seawater may contain hundreds of thousands of individuals. Together, the world's marine phytoplankton absorb as much carbon dioxide and give off as much oxygen as all the trees and every other land plant combined. They're also the ocean's primary producers, the first link in the food chain. Without them, hardly any other sea life would be possible. Phytoplankton are typically the width of a fine hair, but can be much smaller. Magnification reveals a parallel universe of intricate structures, the stuff of acid dreams, solitary spaceships, and implausibly geometric shapes, minute snakes and ladders, and garlands of elaborate beads on infinitesimal threads. There are thousands of different species. Some phytoplankton can even create light through a chemical process called bioluminescence, which has probably evolved as a defense mechanism. Incredibly, light generated by the community of phytoplankton and triggered by movement appears to startle predators, while simultaneously attracting larger sea creatures that may see off the would-be attackers. A nocturnal bioluminescent bloom in a warm, smooth sea is one of the most achingly beautiful sights in nature. The experience of swimming in such vastness, engulfed by a luminous, pulsing community, and knowing that individually insignificant phytoplankton are the source of almost all nourishment and life in the ocean, is truly humbling. Now, still on photosynthesis, here's a plant you might know. This is mare's tail or horsetail. It's very, very abrasive. It's got a lot of silicates, sand effectively, used for furniture in Japan, for polishing it, and for sculpting clarinet reeds. It's a very, very primitive plant, so primitive that the big brothers of this plant, called calamites, massive trees, 50 million years high, were around about 360 million years ago. And they didn't rot, quite probably, and there's debate about this, quite probably because bacteria and fungi hadn't evolved yet to break down lignin, which is a sort of component of woody things. And those bacteria and fungi took another 60 million years or so to work out how to do that. So in that time, all this material from these huge trees and other things like them got squished and didn't rot. And that period is called the Carboniferous period. And all of the world's coal was formed in that period. From a climate change point of view, it's best to leave that coal where it is, thank you very much, rather than releasing millions of years worth of carbon dioxide by burning it. Nowadays, of course, dead wood does rot. And when it does, carbon dioxide will go back into the atmosphere. So building lots and lots of wooden framed buildings is definitely a good idea, as is anything else which will sequester wood or wood products without letting them rot. So of course it is absolutely the best thing in the world to buy lots and lots and lots of books, and preferably to read them obviously as well, but just by buying them you'll be sequestering some carbon. Now, it's all very well photosynthesizing, and not much good if something eats you before you've had time to live and to reproduce. So you need to defend yourself. And when an insect or any other herbivore looks at this scene, they probably think lunch. So plants have developed all sorts of strategies to defend themselves, and I could do a whole talk, or an expert could do a whole talk on how plants defend themselves. But there's spiny things, there's spikes, there's the tannins in oak trees, there's the two-part poisons in cherry laurel that you champ on it and make cyanide. There's manchineel, which is just the most horrible plant in the world, that every part of it is just caustic and ghastly. There's caffeine, which we'll come on to later, and there's this, which is this might look like kind of something's been eating it, which it has, and you might think that the plant is defending itself with some sort of poison or something like that. But the way that this plant is defending itself is by attracting using pheromones, the thing that eats the thing that is eating it. I do love that. I gave a talk once at GCHQ, would you believe, about trees, and the room went strangely silent when I talked about that. Now, here's a particularly well-defended plant, possibly familiar to you. Everywhere you go in the world, I can promise you this, people think, I mean, everywhere in the tropics that's reasonably dry, people think that this is a local plant that's native to where they live. So I've been to Israel, where these fruit are called sabras, which describes the people who've grown up in the country, and you know, they think, you know, misty-eyed that this is a local plant. I've been to Australia, where they think this is a local plant. I've been all sorts of places, but actually this plant comes from Mexico. And to the Aztecs, it was Tenochtli, the goddess of the sun, and you can perhaps see why that's the case. It's a very interesting plant, actually. What looks like leaves, you might think these are leaves. These are known as pads, and they're actually kind of adapted stems. And the leaves are these things, these spines here, which are just especially adapted leaves. The fruit are edible. Though, can we just admit it, they're a bit disappointing. Not enough acid really to make it sort of appealing, I think. The pads are really rather good. So if you they're known as nopal, and if you go to Mexico, you often have them as a vegetable, and they're rather fine actually, as long as the prickles have been removed. But this plant is culturally so important that the Mexican flag has a prickly pear in the middle of it. See that? It's even fruiting. And you might wonder, well, why is that? And when the Spanish arrived in the sort of early 16th century to the conquistadors arrived in Mexico, they found that the Aztecs had been not only sort of clothing themselves in textiles that were dyed this wonderful red color, which has an association, which we'll come to, with the plant, but had been managing to do this apparently for hundreds of years. And the plant is still cultivated for that reason. So even today, people have this dye which they get from the prickly pear, Opuntia. And the way they get the dye is not from the plant itself, but from these little beetles that are called cochineal, that live on the pads. And the beetles sort of surround themselves with a bit of this waxy stuff to sort of protect themselves a bit. But they're bright red, and the Aztecs had bred these little beetles and farmed them on the pads of prickly pears for hundreds of years in a method that's still used today. So they hang little beetle houses on there, and the beetles kind of you know, move in and take over the cactus. And the dye is you know, you have to grind up lots and lots and lots of little beetles in order to make the cochineal dye. But the Spanish were absolutely stunned by these fabrics that the Aztecs had. And after silver and gold, cochineal became the most valuable export from Mexico. It was used by royalty. Spain managed to protect its secret source for about 200 years, but eventually everyone got in on it. The Star-Spangled Banner was dyed with cochineal. Cromwell's soldiers Cromwell chose cochineal for the dye for his soldiers' uniforms. And of course, what this meant was that the European powers planted this Opuntia, the prickly pear, all over their empires. And now, you know, cacti don't do so well in Europe, but having planted it all over the colonies, it really took off, and not always in a good way. So in 1788, the governor of New South Wales, Australia, introduced it. There are vast areas of arid lands. They planted a whole load of a puntia of prickly pear. What could possibly go wrong? Well, unfortunately, what went wrong was that, you know, they thought they were going to have loads of scarlet dye from the little insects that would live on these prickly pears. But unfortunately, these insects have been bred and bred and bred over centuries, so much so that they could only really survive in Mexico in just the right conditions. And with nothing to eat, with nothing to eat it, the cactus just spread like wildfire. And by 1925, 100,000 square miles of grazing land in Australia were covered in prickly pear. People tried slashing it, burning it. Thousands of tons of ghastly arsenic compounds, which still have an effect, unfortunately, were dumped on it. Nothing worked. Eventually, in what I think is probably the most important biocontrol project ever, 3 billion eggs of an encouragingly named Mexican moth called Cactoblastis cactorum were introduced. Now, they'd evolved in Mexico to dine out on prickly pear and largely solved the problem, except, of course, those moths have now spread around the world and are attacking other cacti. So in Australia, this is the moth and the larvae, and you know, it solved the problem. And nowadays you can see, you know, grateful thanks. I don't know if you can see, but that you probably can't actually, but it says on it, Bunaga, which is in Queensland, Cactoblastis Memorial Hall. And you've got all sorts of monuments around Australia to Cactoblastis. And I was doing a short presentation to some folks in Melbourne this morning, and they, you know, when I said Cactoblastis, they all went, ah. I didn't have to tell them this story. So nowadays, Mexican cochineal is making quite a comeback because people are moving away somewhat from synthetic dyes. It's used for textiles and also often the carmine color in lipsticks. And in 1860, Gaspar Campari, yes, Campari, used it to color his famous drink. And in some places in the world, if you look very carefully at the label, you can see that carmine, as it's often called, cochineal, is still used to color Campari, not in the United Kingdom as far as I know. Here's another kind of defense mechanism. This is dandelion. The seeds of dandelion obviously carry an awful long way, and the way they managed to carry was in a wonderful paper in Nature about 2 or 3 years ago. Again, the references are online, but these seeds kind of they drift on tiny halos of spinning air, like a kind of horizontal smoke ring. If you can imagine, without the smoke, of course. But what I wanted to talk about was the latex that many plants have latex to sort of gum up insects and seal wounds and sometimes poison insects actually as well. And rubber is probably the best known of those latexes. You know about rubber trees. But who knew about dandelion rubber, eh? So dandelions have latex in the roots as a defense mechanism. And this is our traditional common or garden British dandelion. And this is its relative known as Russian dandelion, grows in Eastern Europe and Russia. And it's got a particularly large amount of latex in it. So there is latex in our dandelions, but there's more of it in that sort. And during the war in the United States and in Eastern Europe, when supplies of rubber were being disrupted from the Far East, people planted quite big fields experimentally of dandelions to see whether they could actually make dandelion rubber. And they were kind of successful, but then the war ended and supplies came back, and so they didn't really pursue it. But just recently, there's been a big EU project and also a US project to grow dandelion rubber again, because with so much pressure on forests in the tropics, people are trying to look for other land that they could use rather than sort of felling trees and planting rubber plantations. And the first rubber tires made out of dandelion rubber are on the market. So you know, you can find those. They don't sort of make a big deal of the fact that they're made out of dandelion rubber, but it's beginning to happen. And here's tobacco. So this is another feisty solanum. You know, as I say, Sandra, the expert on solanums, you know, don't heckle. If I get something wrong, just tell me quietly afterwards. The tobacco plant has some, in common with other solanums, has some nasty poisons, and the way that it deters insects, or one of the ways, is to have these trichomes, these little sort of hairy things that are exuding nicotine-laden liquid and it's kind of sticky as well, which really insects prefer not to have. So originally native to Bolivia, transported throughout the Americas by Native Americans, and then and used ritually by indigenous people. And obviously it became a huge business. Mid 18th century, 140,000 enslaved people, mainly in Virginia and Maryland, working for the tobacco aristocracy, which included the US founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. It's not a very happy history, tobacco, I'm afraid. And, you know, selling a highly addictive habit is an absolutely brilliant business model and massively profitable for the directors and shareholders of tobacco companies. Yet tobacco has killed and maimed more people than any other plant, uses 15,000 square miles of the Earth's surface that could be otherwise used to grow food or set aside to conserve forest. I frankly marvel at the mental gymnastics of the men and women who deploy all their intelligence, their wealth, their lobbying power to present themselves and their companies as model corporate citizens. Don't get me started on the fossil fuel industry, or do get me started, but later. And here, another solanum. Look at the typical flower shape there. This is Mandrake. So you might think that Mandrake is just the stuff of you know, Hogwarts, but Mandrake is a real plant representing Italy here. These feisty solanums, honestly, that's used since ancient times as an anesthetic, often added to wine. And anesthetics were so important and so special to people when there were really very few painkillers that inevitably there were all sorts of occult associations. So the shape of the root looked a bit like a person, especially with a bit of judicious whittling. And the story went that the scream of the mandrake could be so deadly it was best to tie a dog to the root and have the dog pull it out rather than doing it yourself. You know, that's possibly, you know, one theory is that that was actually a rumor put about by people who wanted to stop people stealing this very, very valuable plant, which was used for anesthesia. I just have a short reading about the mandrake. Several 14th and 15th century accounts describe witches' salves made from mandrake and other psychoactive plants, pounded together with grease. Such ointments hasten the absorption of hallucinogenic drugs in mandrake through the skin and especially through the body's mucous membranes. One substance, hyoscine, is known often to impart a convincing sensation of flying, which plausibly explains why so many medieval woodcuts depict nude or partially clothed witches, airborne and straddling broomsticks, an idea that still has common currency. Although mandrake's use as an anesthetic ended with the introduction of ether and chloroform in the mid-19th century, some of its other ancient associations live on. In the 1930s, one of the first comic book superheroes was Mandrake the magician. And in the 1960s, a sedative pill called Mandrax, among many chemically similar products, was the one brand that became associated with promiscuous sex. And today, at least one commercial fragrance uses the name Mandragora to simultaneously conjure helpless abandon and beguiling agency, just as it has for millennia. So, coffee. Let me read you a little more about coffee. As I say, this is a sort of a book-related event, so I'm not bashful about doing readings here and there. The little evergreen coffee tree began life somewhere near the forested mountains of southwestern Ethiopia, and its broad elliptical leaves with crinkled edges, shiny and dark above and pastel pale underneath, still prefer the shade. In full flower, coffee is a spellbinding but ephemeral joy. For just a couple of days, thousands of delicate white blossoms with the light fragrance of honeysuckle and jasmine can festoon a single tree. The smoothly oval fruits ripen to pillar-box red. Their thin layer of edible flesh tastes of watermelon and apricot and surrounds a pair of deeply grooved seeds that are the familiar coffee beans. The coffee tree didn't develop caffeine for our benefit. When its leaves die and drop, their caffeine leaches into the soil, impeding the germination and growth of competing plants. And it's also a defense, sometimes a lethal one, against various insects and fungi. It is therefore surprising that coffee, and even some unrelated citrus plants, put caffeine in their nectar, which after all is meant to reward insects for ferrying pollen to other plants. It turns out that the merest dash of caffeine, below the threshold that bees can sense, helps them to remember the plant, making them more likely to return to it. The flowers shrewdly dispense just enough caffeine to be pharmacologically active, but not enough to be bothersome. So if you've done your photosynthesis, you've grown, and you've managed to defend yourself, a plant needs to reproduce. And essentially, they can do this asexually by suckers or vegetatively somehow by taking a piece of themselves and sort of plonking themselves somewhere else, or a person doing that. And asexual reproduction is quick and easy. So after a fire, these aspen trees can reproduce through suckers, they can recolonize quickly. And if you can't make flowers or there's nothing around to spread pollen, then that can be a sort of useful thing to do. And it's useful for growers because, we know when we clone plants exactly what we'll get. But there are disadvantages too. All of these trees that you see here are clones of each other. And elms, for example, which spread really well with suckers, the Romans planted lots of them from cuttings, all very genetically similar in this country. Local populations virtually cloned themselves from that, and were extraordinarily vulnerable to the fungus Dutch elm disease spread by beetles. And this is what you get in cloned communities. You get plants that are very, very vulnerable to disease. And I was expecting a different slide, but not to worry. The vulnerability actually costs lives. See these typical, again, solanum flowers. This is a potato, and these you might not be familiar with unless you sort of think about botany, in a sort of nerdy way as I do. These are potato fruits. Now, normally you're used to seeing the potato tubers, but these potato fruits, which you don't normally allow the plant to go to fruit, are very much like tomatoes, which of course is another member of the family. They'd probably be happy to have their flowers pollinated, but they don't get that chance. the potatoes are propagated by planting the tubers themselves, and we see a few kinds in the shops. But in its native range in Peru, there are hundreds and hundreds of different varieties. They didn't catch on at first in Europe because the association with poisonous members of the family, right? So people were very skeptical about them. But rulers saw advantage of a crop that could produce so much nutritious food in so small a space. And in 18th century France, they ostentatiously posted guards around fields so that people would think, well, that's really valuable, we'll plant some of that. Frederick the Great of Prussia held a public potato banquet, in order to encourage people, food fit for a king must be good, and it caught on big time. By the 1930s, in Ireland, they were dangerously dependent on just one variety of one species, absolutely cloned. And we know the story of the Irish lumper potato and Phytophthora infestans, water mold, bit like a fungus, potato blight that struck. Plants withered and rotted, 1 million people died, 2 million people emigrated. But this actually isn't just the story of the vulnerability of cloned plants. It's something else as well, and it's the story of man's inhumanity to man, I'm afraid, because there was actually a lot of food in Ireland at the time, and under British rule, it was exported to Britain. So 1 million people died, 2 million people emigrated, and those people needn't really have died. Very sad. But one of the few groups of people to help at the time who had known great hardship themselves were the Choctaw Nation. And if you go to County Cork now, you can see this monument to the help that was received by the Irish people from the Choctaw Nation, who sent money. And recently, in a nice sort of reciprocation, the Irish government have helped the Choctaw people from cope with the pandemic, and it's a sort of a rather wonderful end to a very horrible story. This is the slide I thought I was going to have earlier. This ubiquitous Cavendish banana that we all know is also at risk now. It's despite the magnificent flower, almost all bananas have been bred not to have seeds, so they're infertile. And it's another cloned crop, so essentially taking a bit of the plant and growing other bits from it, and very vulnerable to a fungal disease that's spreading around the world, kept in check at the moment by massive amounts of chemical cosseting. But we're running out of fungicides, and they're nasty chemicals anyway. And we really should be growing and consuming many more different varieties of bananas. These ones travel well, as I said, so they tend to be very popular. Now, I've been talking about asexual reproduction, vegetative reproduction, but the other way, of course, is sexual reproduction. And that's good because you get genetic variation, less vulnerable to disease. Pollen carries the male sex cells. You can either spread your pollen around by wind, as the grasses do, as this alder tree does. But surely there's a more efficient way of getting the pollen exactly where it needs to go. And the answer is to use insects to carry the pollen directly to where it needs to go in the next plant. And one of the things oh, it's another solanum, surprise, surprise. These tomato plants have evolved to only release their pollen when a bumblebee raises its wing beat, not for the normal flight beat, but to a middle C. And then there's the resonance, it buzzes the pollen out, and off the bee flies to the next flower. And commercial growers have bumblebees on supply, for this purpose. But here's a wacky thing about sound and tomatoes, that in peer-reviewed research in decent journals, scientists in Korea have found that if you play loud sound to ripening tomatoes, the actual fruit, you can delay their ripening by up to a week. And it's a sound of about a high C will do it, fairly loud, and delay by about a week. And that's useful to farmers potentially because you know, you don't want all your crop to suddenly hit the market at the same time. You know, you'll lose out that way. Now, you know, there are two questions that arise. You know, how does that work? And secondly, you know, how on earth did someone discover that? You know, aren't you just amazed by human ingenuity and curiosity? How it works is a conversation for another time. I don't think it's completely known, but there are some theories, and there's some stuff on the website about that. It often pays to have a plant, you know, a plant animal relationship with a faithful particular pollinator. You know, they depend on each other. The pollinator gets reliable food and the plant gets reliable pollination. This is the peacock flower, gloriously misnamed by someone who's never seen a peacock. Peacocks are blue, right? Of Barbados. And the yellow against orange coloring here is particularly going to put off this hummingbird and attract this butterfly. And the nectar tube is just the right length for the butterfly and not the hummingbird, and so on. The flower times its nectar to when the butterflies are feeding and not the hummingbirds, and so on. Just another short reading. The peacock flower is exuberant but tinged with sadness too. Its seeds contain poisons that have been used by tribespeople in the region to induce abortion as a means of family planning. During the era of slavery, captive women who were expected to produce children in order to enhance the future wealth of plantations resorted to those seeds to abort their babies, preventing them from being born into a humiliating life of backbreaking cruelty. In 2018, for her royal wedding to Prince Harry, Meghan Markle's spectacular flowing veil was embroidered with distinctive flora of each nation of the British Commonwealth. Representing Barbados, the peacock flower was a poignant reminder of the slave trade and somberly resonant with the Duchess of Sussex's own ancestry. And finally, of course, you have seeds, the plant's future generation that need to be dispersed so as not to compete with the parent tree. The fruit is often nutritious and appealing to something that will eat it and disperse the seeds, and that, you know, often the fruit is laxative as well, so that the seeds are dispersed with a bit of fertilizer. Now, this is nutmeg, which reached India from its home in Indonesia about 2,500 years ago. Reached Europe in the 13th century or so. Arab traders kept the source secret for centuries. Very expensive, very desirable, enlivened boring food, but also it was used as an amulet. Leonardo da Vinci in 1510, for his trip to Padua, included a list of reminders to himself: spectacles with case, penknife, sheets of paper, scalpel, acquire a skull, nutmeg. The wars and skirmishes for control over nutmeg trade went on and on and on between the Dutch and the British and the French. In 1667, the British finally gave up their claim to the island of Run, which is in Indonesia, the main source of nutmeg at the time. They finally gave up their claim, but they wanted something in return. And they thought, well, we'll have that hopeless little Dutch outpost in North America. And what they got in return was Manhattan. So Manhattan was exchanged for nutmeg rights. In 18th century, the nutmegs were rumored to spice up physical desire and performance, which meant, of course, that the price was sky high. European gentlemen carried pocket nutmeg graters, which of course meant, you know, there was a good business selling those as well. See the little compartment there for the nutmegs to go in. And I'm going to finish. Well, we've just got about 2 minutes left, and I'll just finish with a couple of little readings about nutmeg. Nutmeg flowers, although pale and inconspicuous, are fragrant and shaped like dainty urns, while the fruit are yellowish, speckled, and about the size of a tennis ball. A single tree can yield thousands in a season. At the center, in a glossy shell, sits the rough nutmeg kernel or nut that is well known as a spice. Its flavor is special, warm, woody, and thrillingly unique. The pleasure of its scent is enhanced by the intricate pattern of vessels containing the essential oils, gradually revealed by grating. Girdling the shiny nut is a succulent, lacy layer, an utterly sensual, blood-red aril or seed covering, which is itself surrounded by a fleshy husk. When the fruit is ripe, the husk splits, revealing the garish aril, an alluring snack for nutmeg pigeons and their reward for dispersing the seed. The aril, which is the spice known as mace, dries to a warm beige and has a softer and more complex flavor than nutmeg. A little nutmeg is a warming delight, but a whole seed or two in one go is dangerously narcotic and widely reported to be hallucinogenic. One would need to be desperate for a high, though, since the side effects, vomiting, confusion, dizziness, and heart arrhythmia, are discouraging. It has only ever been a psychoactive drug of last resort. The African-American activist, Malcolm X, wrote in his autobiography about using nutmeg in jail in the 1940s. It was later banned from prison kitchens in the United States to avoid misuse, and generations of students have tried and generally failed to achieve a cheap and rewarding nutmeg high. The most common misuses of nutmeg these days are to powder it too far in advance of use or to heat it for too long. Both culinary crimes destroy its precious but fugitive flavor. Nutmeg should be grated respectfully at the end of cooking. That way, even boiled rice pudding can be a pleasure. I'll finish with one of my favorite plants for its stunning flowers, and the fruit is okay too, pineapple. The pineapple was so rare and expensive in the 18th century that people used to rent them out as an accessory for people to take to parties. They were associated with nobility and aristocracy, the only people who could afford them, so they entered into the language. In the late 18th, early 19th century, pineapple denoted really brilliant things. So, you know, something would be the very pineapple of a picnic. That chap was a real charmer. He is the very pineapple. And today, you know, I've chosen plants which are familiar, but I hope with one or two surprises. I haven't had time to tell you about the more obscure ones. You know, the mind-altering iboga from Cameroon with its strange initiation rites, the cook pine from South Pacific that inexplicably leans towards the equator wherever it grows in the world, north or south, the extraordinary tree fuchsia of New Zealand, and so on. But we do want some time for questions, so I'd better stop there, and I'll leave you with a final message. Trees, plants, they need water, they need carbon dioxide, a few other nutrients, they need to defend themselves, and they need a way to reproduce. And they need one more thing, which is they need some love. They need our love to give them the habitats and the space that they need. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much indeed. If you want to get in touch, those are my details. And if you want to look up references to anything I've said, then just go to the website and you'll find them there. Thank you. Can I stop sharing my screen now?
Well, we could leave the picture up. We could leave the picture up. John, thank you so much. I would say that was the very pineapple of a talk. Absolutely fantastic. There are a lot of different questions coming in, but there's also a lot of comments saying, fantastic talk, so interesting. So people really, really loved it.
I'm grateful. I find it extraordinarily difficult to talk to a screen. And thank you for just sort of folks being patient, because I know it's not easy, Zoom. And I find it very hard without feedback, actually, just talking to a lens.
It is hard, but you conveyed so beautifully your love for plants and also the amazing stories that come with them. And a couple of different people have asked, and this is one of my questions as well, is it must have been really difficult to narrow down to just 80 plants. How did you decide what to leave in and what to leave out?
Well, with around the world in 80 trees, I had to pick 80 out of 60,000. For this, I think you'll know better than me, but I think there are about 400,000 or so,
Oh,
450,000, I don't know, something like that, 500,000 maybe, less, all right. That, you know, and picking them, I had several criteria. One was there needed to be a geographic distribution. Well, that's easy. Second, there needed to be a sort of variety of different sorts of plants. So I've chosen quite a few solanums tonight in your honor.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
But you know, there needed to be different kinds of plants, really, sort of you know, from all sorts of different families. And the most important thing to me was that I wanted this to be a science book, but or I wanted it to be a book about science, but not a science book. I wanted it to be a book about culture, but not a culture book, a book about history, but not a history book. And therefore, I was looking for stories that where I hoped that someone coming from any of those disciplines would find something, even if they were really knowledgeable about those things, would find something else in it that would be a bit of a surprise. So even if you know the whole botany of nutmeg, you might find the Malcolm X story a bit of a surprise in there. You know, and for each one of these, I hoped that I would find something, and that actually made it quite hard to find species where there was really something new to say. And that enabled me to narrow it down a lot, because I ended up with a lot of things where I just thought, yeah, that's not quite exciting enough.
I know it's so hard. I mean, there's so many stories. And I love the way you've weaved together kind of culture and history and that complete love of plants. There's some quite specific questions which I'll try to kind of riddle them together. So somebody asked, what was the name of the plant that attracted the predator of its predator? They were interested in the predator of his predator, which is actually a very cool story.
Yeah, it is. It is a really cool story, and I just can't remember offhand. And you know, I'll make sure the references on the website. And you know, when you're doing this kind of presentation, half of your brain actually disappears. I think it just shuts down. And you know, if you ask me my mother's name, I'd probably forget.
Well, I know, and I think that the answer to that question is buy the book.
Well, no, it's actually not in this book, that example. It's in the tree book, and
buy that book.
And also, I don't like telling people they have to go and buy a book in order to get the answer.
No, that's true. That's true.
So I you know, if you just contact me through the website or through that web address that's up, email address, then whoever it is that asked the question, I'll just send you the answer.
That's really kind. I mean, plants do extraordinary things, and I teach in a course at University College London about behavioral ecology, and I teach a whole section about do plants behave. And actually, what I hope is that I do convince people at the end that plants do behave. And I think you've convinced us, you know, tonight that plants do behave. A couple of people have asked the kind of a similar sort of question about did you manage to travel to some of these places where these plants are, and maybe what plant would you love to encounter that you haven't yet seen?
Oh gosh,
so many.
I've been very fortunate in being able to travel, partly with my previous work at the BBC and partly with expeditions for Kew and other organizations, where filmmakers are in quite a lot of demand by biologists, because they want people to come along and document what they're doing. So I got to go on various expeditions for Kew. In fact, the plant that you see up there on the screen, which is from around the world in 80, actually it's in 80 plants. It's Aloidendron dichotomum. It's the quiver tree of Namibia, and this was on my bucket list for ages. I mean, you can't really tell from that picture, but I'm actually quite close to the camera. So that tree is about 40 feet high. And I know by some people's standards, it's not a tree, right? You know, I know, but you know,
Looks
I'm not,
to me.
I'm not pedantic like that. To me, it looks like it's big and woody, and that'll do. You know, it looks like a tree. And one of the things that I love about that plant is it's not so much the fact that it grows in very, very inhospitable desert and manages to flourish, and it's got these fantastic flowers and things which you can't see there in that picture. It's not so much that, it's the fact that partly it's the national tree of Namibia. So, you know, it's when anyone sees it, they smile. Right, so that's one reason that I love it, and the other reason is that it's got this kind of waxy coating, which is sort of quite white, and which has probably evolved to reflect the huge amount of ultraviolet light that there is, and protect the tree somewhat. And this waxy coating is very tactile. It's a lovely thing to touch. And I think if I was a tree, I'd like to be that tree that people would smile at and want to stroke. But in terms of things that I'd love to see that I haven't, I managed to see welwitschia on that same trip, which is a pretty amazing thing. I would love to see. I'd love to go to New Caledonia and see those kind of nickel absorbing, you know, trees that you know that when you burn them, you know, sort of 25% of the weight of the thing is nickel. You know, it's just,
No, I'm with you there. That,
and they have this bright blue, absolutely sort of, you know, turquoise, hurt your eyes, bright blue sap. And I think that's the only tree, the only plant in the two books that I haven't seen either in real life or in a botanic garden. But I do commend you to go to, you know, botanic gardens wherever you are, because, you know, that's just a great place to travel the world, you know.
no, you're absolutely right. I think botanical gardens and museums too, in a way, are a way to see the world from, you know, in a few hours. You know, it's not quite the same as going to all kinds of exotic places, but you know, we can't do that now so much anymore, and so botanic gardens are a really great place to do that. Someone's asked a really interesting question about that so many plants around the world are known, grown, and eaten in Europe. So we grow lots of things in Europe because of the colonial history of Europe. Are there examples of European plants which went the other way, so to speak? So from Europe to colonized countries?
Well, you know, the sort of, well, I mean, there are plenty of plants that came through Europe and then went to other places. So rubber would be one, for example, that you know, Kew Gardens took from South America and planted in, you know, worked out how to propagate it and planted it in Malaysia and you know, the other part of the empire. You've got invasive plants like water hyacinth that were taken from the Amazon region and planted, you know, originally by Belgians, probably introduced into Africa as a sort of pond ornament and then spread all over the place, you know, rather destructively. In terms of European plants, I'm trying to think of what ones those might be. Well, chrysanthemums, I think, would be one. That they've originated, I think, in the sort of Dalmatian coast and the sort of Balkan area, and those are planted quite widely now as a source of insecticides, pesticides. Yeah. And interestingly, chrysanthemums, you know, they're another one of those plants that attract the predator of the thing that eats them as well, which is sort of really neat. So that would be one example, I guess.
Yeah, the woody nightshade, your woody nightshade is another one, because it's native to Europe and is all over the United States and is probably introduced there. We don't really know, but we think so. And garlic mustards, garlic mustard, which is common here in Europe, is another one which has been gone the other way. So I mean, plants are amazing because they sort of follow railroads and all that sort of stuff. I mean, plants are incredible. I can't believe people don't think that plants behave, because they really do extraordinary things. Somebody else has asked a question about the kind of the increase in nicotine and caffeine in the kind of plants that we use for drugs, as it were. And somebody's asked us, would this be the same as breeding for a larger fruit? Because they can't really imagine how people could measure for those compounds back then.
Well, I think that people could measure for those compounds because they could try them. So I think there was a very strong selection pressure. So you wouldn't necessarily be sort of doing chemical experiments to see how much 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine, or caffeine as we know it, was in your sample, but you'd try some and you go, wow, that's knockout. I'll remember that.
Not that one.
Yeah. So and I think with nicotine as well, there are actually the sort of wild nicotine, wild tobacco, has way more nicotine in it than the cultivated one, and so it's sort of slightly gone the other way. But people are also selecting not just for for example, with coffee, you're selecting not just for the amount of caffeine, but also how well does it grow here or there. How does it do with drought or with waterlogging? What's the sort of season in which it'll grow? You're selecting for all kinds of different things, and this is why it's so important for us to have a source of the crop wild relatives. When you want to breed from new varieties of tomatoes or coffee or any of our crops, you need to go back to the wild to find the original genes that might have resistance to particular diseases or give us these traits that we want. And protecting those habitats of the crop wild relatives is massively important, very, very important.
Yeah, so on that line, I'd just like to ask you is what do you think about domesticating new species, or domesticating for us to domesticate things that we haven't yet domesticated?
Well, we rely for 50% of our calories on just 3 species: maize, or corn as it's called in the United States, rice, and wheat. And that makes us, that's not great diet, great for our diets. It's not great for the environment, because you get these vast monocultures. It's not good for anyone really. And I think we get 85% of our calories just from 12 species. So introducing other species, in a careful way, is generally a good thing, I think. So an example would be amaranth. Amaranth is it grows in South America. It's a sort of something that was traditionally grown before the Spanish conquest in places like Peru and so on. Little tiny seeds. You may know it as the garden plant Love Lies Bleeding. Or in France, they call it nun's scourge, because they have some funny ideas about nuns. But it's actually a very, very good food. Even the leaves are good in vitamin C and surprisingly high in protein, but the seeds really have a whole range of amino acids and things that make it a very, very good food for us. And they're starting to grow it in India and in Nepal and so on. And it's an example of a plant actually that the Spanish conquistadors, they associated the plant with religious practices that they saw as being kind of undermining Catholicism, because people were making, they were mixing the seeds with agave syrup and then making figures of gods, and then eating those in order to take on the attributes of the particular god. And they saw a parallel between that and communion, and they forbid people from growing it and so on. And it's taken 500 years for that plant to sort of really come back in a big way in South America. And that is an example, I think, of a plant that could be a really helpful, really good food. And there are plenty of others.
Yeah, thank you. There's there's a couple of questions. There was a question at the very beginning, and there's another one now about the dandelion tires. So are these most tires are not produced with dandelion latex. I mean, that's pretty clear. But are dandelion tires available commercially?
Yeah, they're made by a company called Continental, and if you look up Continental dandelion tire, then they exist, or they certainly did a few years ago. I don't know whether they still do, but it's possible that they've chosen not to market the sort of dandelion component in the same way. I have a feeling they might do, again, because of the sort of interest in green things coming back.
Right.
But it's something that is still rather experimental. So what they're trying to do is to get the yield. They're breeding the it's Taraxacum coxaegis, which is a sort of Russian dandelion. They're trying to breed that to get the percentage of latex higher and higher and higher. And when they reach a particular point, then it'll become economically worthwhile on a much larger scale. And dandelions grow pretty well in Eastern Europe and so on. There are large fields of dandelions. Estonia has just taken the dandelion to heart. It's the sort of national flower. But during the war, they showed that they could easily cultivate dandelions, and so it is something that as people are trying to save forests, that it could be a source of a large scale source of rubber.
It's super interesting. I mean, of course, you can have dandelion leaves are lovely in salads and things.
Yeah, and very trendy, Sandy.
Oh, is it? I'm on trend. Excellent, John. That's fantastic to know. Somebody's asked if cacao or vanilla are mentioned in the book at all. Did you?
Yes, yeah, both cacao and vanilla are in there. There are several twists on vanilla that surprised me. So one of them was the method of pollination with a little bamboo sliver and squishing the flowers together, which was invented by an enslaved boy in the middle of the 19th century in Réunion, and is the technique that's still used, because the Melipona bees that live in Central and South America, where cacao came from, they don't travel. So you have to pollinate by hand. And farmers, this is incredibly valuable crop. So farmers actually inscribe each pod with a code. So they get a stylus and they inscribe each pod, so that if there's a theft, then people know where it came from.
Where it came from.
And cacao is in the book as well. And the sort of thing about chocolate to me that was interesting was that the coffee houses were very much the province of men doing business, and chocolate was much more associated with men and women together. So you had these clubs, which were really the forerunners of the London clubs, which were open to men and women, and there was quite an interesting kind of interplay between coffee and chocolate.
Well, it was also kind of thought, I mean, didn't Sir Hans Sloane think of chocolate as the cure for everything, from tuberculosis to asthma to kind of impotence to whatever? It was.
You're sort of implying that it isn't.
Well, I don't know. I don't know, Jonathan.
Yeah,
It probably is. It actually probably is. I mean, I have a colleague who absolutely hates chocolate, and I always feel quite sorry for her.
Yeah, I mean, the chocolate plant itself, you know, the process of making chocolate is quite interesting, but the chocolate plant itself depends on these little kind of midgy flies to pollinate. And if you don't have those little midgy flies, you don't get no chocolate.
It
You
just
know,
shows the interconnection of all things. And I think that's the wonderful thing about the way you've presented these 80 plants is not only their connection with humans, but also their connection with much of the rest of biodiversity, which means you take one bit out and we have a real problem.
yeah, in fact, that reminds me of, you know, that sort of that parlor game where you have a tower that you take bits out of
I
until
lose that always.
Jenga, I think it's called. And that's the analogy that I use actually in the introduction to the book for biodiversity, because, you know, we are in these complicated webs and you take bits out and you think that it's still okay, but actually you've taken away the resilience and you only need a nudge and the whole lot collapses.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Somebody's asked if and this is the thing that we dealt with in a slightly earlier talk here at the Linnean Society, is about what's your opinion on people viewing dandelions as weeds when they have so many amazing abilities?
Well, look, you know, of course, you're setting me up to say that nothing's a weed, everything's valuable, and so
Of course, I'm setting you up.
you know, and I sort of, you know, we have a lawn. I'm just looking at it out the window here, and it has a lot of cowslips in it, and it has a lot of dandelions in it, and it has a few other prickly things which I don't really like in it. But you know, I rejoice in that. You know, anyone who's kind of interested in plants and biology and you know, biodiversity will revel in a variety of plants. That's not to say that you know, you want dandelions on Central Court at Wimbledon, but I I don't see weeds in that way. I mean, weeds are just plants that we got too much of in the wrong places. But, you know, when I'm looking at, you know, at a railway station and there are sort of things growing in the tracks and that, I don't see those as weeds. I see that as a delightful thing that is, you know, a menu for some insects.
I'm totally with you there. I love the sight of a flower between railway tracks. It's just one of those things that makes you think, you know, there is life and wonder everywhere.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And I think we just have a few minutes left until it's time for us to stop. And Gina has asked, do you have any unusual plants in your own garden? Because you've just talked about your lawn with dandelions and cowslips. But are you a keen gardener or?
No, I'm a crap gardener. My wife is quite a good gardener. I'm terrible. You know, sort of kiss of death for any plant, really. You know, I'll be there photographing it, looking at it, observing it, enjoying it. Tracy, my wife, will be busy, you know, making it live. I don't think that there's anything. I mean, I could come all over sort of holier than thou and say, obviously, I only have native plants in my garden. But actually, you know, there are plants here that give me pleasure. I'm down in Dorset at the moment, actually, but and I'm looking out the window and I can see the quince tree, and to me, quinces are just the kind of fantastic thing.
Amazing.
And they're in the tree book, but I think, you know, I don't have anything sort of particularly exotic or special, except I'll tell you, there is one thing that I do have, and it's something that my son gave me, and I think that it's legal. I think it's okay.
I'm sure it's legal.
Because I'm not cultivating it. I'm just sort of looking after it. And obviously I'm not going to do anything with it. But it's he gave me 3 peyote plants. And peyote is this sort of cactus that obviously some people use for psychedelic purposes. I think growing them in this country for psychedelic purposes is not a very good idea, because A, they grow incredibly slowly, and B, you know, on my windowsill in a damp Dorset cottage, there's not going to be much ultraviolet.
Probably not. Probably not. Oh, that's fascinating.
I'm sure I would never try that sort of thing, but that's the most exotic thing that I have, and they, you know, I've managed not to kill them yet after about sort of 8 months. But I haven't done anything.
They're pretty. They don't do very much. They just kind of hang out there for quite a long time.
Well, I'm ready, ready for them to grow.
Yeah, but I think the thing that you've shown through this book and through your previous book and through tonight's amazing lecture is that plants can give you pleasure, a huge amount of pleasure, both from knowing their names and knowing scientifically about them, but also knowing about how they connect to culture and history. And I just want to thank you so much for bringing us such a fascinating tour through some amazing diversity here on Earth Day, on this day which we should all be celebrating, the biodiversity that surrounds us every day. And I think you're quite right. Your second to last slide that says plants need love. I think that's absolutely true. And I think we should all go away after tonight loving plants a little bit more. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for tonight's lecture. And I hope you can come back again.
Thank you for having me. And there's just one last thing I would just say is, you know, do please think about joining the Linnean Society, because it is huge fun and very important as well. So, you know, please do that if you're watching. And the other thing is that if we were all together in the same room, we'd be sort of shaking hands and hugging and all of that. So can I just give you all a virtual hug? And
thank
you know, because people need some love as well. So thank you very, very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you for being one of our great fellows of the Linnean Society. And we hope to see you again very soon in person as well as online. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cheerio, everyone. Bye-bye.